Hi there, my friend. I want to thank RG175 for sponsoring this episode of the Independent School Moonshot podcast. Great schools thrive under great leadership. At RG175, we understand that finding the right match between a school and its next leader is a defining moment for both heads and trustees. With extensive experience in independent school leadership and a highly personalized approach, we guide boards through thoughtful search processes and support school leaders through key career transitions. Whether you're looking for your next leadership opportunity or seeking the ideal fit for your school, RG175 is here to help. Visit rg175.com. Again, that's rg175.com to learn more, because behind every successful school is a great leader. Hey everyone, I'm Peter Barron. Welcome to today's case study. So I'm excited for today's conversation. We're going to get into this concept of a chief people officer, all kinds of good stuff. But first, let me introduce you to our guests. So first, I'm joined by Min Kim. She is the former chief people officer at Avenues The World School, and Diego Merino. He is the former head of recruitment at Avenues The World School. So two colleagues coming together today to talk about why schools should be thinking about a chief people officer. Diego, Min, thank you so much.
Great to be here.
Yeah. Hey, so we're going to get into this topic, but before we do, I just like to set the stage and provide a little bit of context around the work that you've done. So can you talk a little bit about your work and your careers?
Sure. Peter, as you said, I was until very recently the chief people officer at Avenues The World School, a global school with campuses in New York, in Sao Paulo, Brazil, Shenzhen, China, San Jose in California, as well as online. That encompasses the world of hiring, leadership development, compensation, sort of all the things that you think about as under the umbrella of a people team. Before joining Avenues, I was with Teach for America here in New York for several years, and then also with the New York City Department of Education as part of their HR transformation team. And then prior to that, I was actually in a different field working in investment banking and strategy consulting for a number of years.
Very cool. How about you, Diego?
Well, I spent the last 8 years of my career or the most recent 8 years at Avenues, the World School, where I started in 2016 as the first and only person there fully dedicated to recruitment or to talent acquisition, to attracting and hiring great people for Avenues, and then helped build up that area, as Min said, as we opened several campuses around the world and added hundreds and hundreds of colleagues across the globe. I got into recruitment in education. In the job before that, I worked at Harlem Village Academy as a wonderful charter school network in New York City. And before that, education has really been a core pillar in my career. It's the family business too. I'm the child and grandchild of educators at the university level. And I started my career as a teacher. I was in Teach for America and taught in the Chicago public schools, and also had a stint working in international philanthropy, human rights philanthropy, specifically in my 20s. And now that Avenues has the Avenues time has ended, working independently as a consultant and really interested in helping schools and organizations get smarter and hopefully do better around how they attract and support and develop people and build great teams.
It's just such an important concept and topic right now. I mean, no surprise to either of you, right? That I've just spoken with so many heads of school, and the data also proves that out at a even larger level, that this, hiring and retention is like literally one of the biggest challenges facing them. It's particularly acute, and there are tons of reasons. Like I like to think of it as a big red flag that the business model is stressed, all sorts of things. But Min, like your role is so unique to schools. The role that you had at Avenues, this concept of a chief people officer. I just love to like level set and understand, like from an independent school context, like how does it, like what is the difference between a chief people officer and somebody who's in a more traditional HR role? That's assuming that like every school has a traditional HR role. I mean, some do, some don't. I mean, it's all across the map based on budgets. But like, what is that difference?
Yeah, sure. So I think that a chief people officer function sort of encompasses everything that's in traditional HR and adds to that. So if you think about traditional HR as hiring excellent people, great onboarding, development, compensation, benefits, all of that, which is incredibly important, but are in many cases just the table stakes of attracting and hopefully retaining great people. I think where a chief people officer sort of goes beyond that is, I think, in several areas. So the first one is the chief people officer or the CPO is really focusing on what we at Avenues called organizational health. And organizational health, the way we defined it, was the ability for any organization, a school, for example, to align everyone in that organization to execute the strategy and to, in a sustainable manner, deliver excellent outcomes over time. That's what healthy organization is able to do. And in order to do that, you need to take a look at all of the people practices that you have underneath under your purview, and really check, are all of those practices reinforcing the strategy? Are they aligned to the mission? Are they aligned to the vision and the values of that organization? And if not, what modifications need to be made to them? So it's really sort of taking not just the functional aspects, but really elevating all of that to thinking about, where does a school want to go? What are its priorities? And how do all the people practices then support those priorities?
How does that align with culture?
Yeah, so culture is definitely a huge part of it. I think the chief people officer is sort of the champion of culture. But that culture means, again, sort of making sure that all of the values, the stated mission, the vision are actually lived experiences for every employee every day. So they're not just words on a wall that you periodically refer to. They are actually concepts that help you every day. For example, in decision making, right? How does the organization's value help leaders make smart decisions when they're faced with a dilemma?
I love that. It's been fascinating over the past year to have all these conversations with heads, and not just heads, but other hiring managers at schools, and just hearing the stories, hearing how hard it is to retain and find talent. From your perspective, and what are like the biggest challenges that you're seeing, and even more like directly, like how could a chief people officer begin to address these issues?
I mean, it is absolutely true that there are unprecedented pressures on schools. I mean, Peter, you're talking about a lot of these. There are these weaknesses in the traditional business model. There are major generational shifts going on in relationship of employees to the workplace, right? There are, all the importantly new pressures that we're all very familiar with around DEI, around creating inclusive cultures. There's the rise of remote work. There are new technologies. So all of these things, and of course, we can't overlook that for schools, the prestige and desirability of the teaching profession that's probably at a 50-year low right now. So while districts are struggling to fill positions across the country, there's no question that is also going to impact independent schools. Now, I would argue that precisely because of the unprecedented complexity of that landscape is exactly why you need to have much more strategic thinking about every aspect of how you try to attract and support and develop and retain your people in a way that is specific to the context of your school and where you are and what kind of market you're in, and with your competition, with the assets that you have, the distinctive mission that you have. You need to put all that together in a way that can make sense for you. And I would say I can't give a recipe for everyone, but
Sure.
a couple of points
different.
there. Just in hiring, for instance, I believe that schools will typically are continuing to do a kind of generic or broadcasting net to look for their talent, and that's probably no longer the right strategy for most people. In fact, you need to get much more specific about who you really are and who's a great fit for you, and then you need to narrow cast more to the more specific people and talent who could really be highly compatible with your school and community and be fulfilled there, as opposed to try to being everything to everyone.
Can you paint a picture? Like, what does narrow casting look like? What would an example of that be?
So, in simple ways, like that can look like just, how you describe your job, how you write job descriptions, how the language that you use to describe the life of a teacher should not be it should not be easily mistakable for any other school, right? You should be able to describe some very particular ways that I'll talk specifically about teachers because that's the core professional schools, of course, why is being a teacher here distinctive or different? It might be around the expectations of the intensity of teamwork and collaboration. That was very big for us at Avenues, for example. There were no such thing as teacher islands at Avenues. And so look at any of our materials, any of our descriptions, and that is a strong theme that goes all the way through them. But then you don't just stop at description. You try to actually show people what that is like. So when they come interview, they might participate in a collaborative teamwork exercise with other people that reinforces to them this is something that is really important, that we really value. It might also show up in places that you advertise, or in how you network, in how you encourage your existing staff and faculty to seek referrals to your school. It has to be tailored to what you think are really the right fit people.
I really love. Oh, go ahead, Min.
I was just going to add sort of another aspect I think that Diego and your team did so well was thinking about hiring needs, not just now or just not even next year, but the next 5 years. Where do we really see the needs to be? And given that there's always shortages of certain types of teachers, what can we do to sort of combat that, right? How are we building the pipeline? So we need to build an internal pipeline because we are never going to find sufficient numbers of qualified teachers that fit our specific needs elsewhere. So it's really that ability to think much further downstream and think about what are some of the strategies that we need to put in place now, such that 5 years from now we'll be in a better position.
What you're saying, so I've done a few case studies on this general topic, and the theme that constantly emerges out of every single one of them is that this kind of talent development, chief people officer strategy is really akin to what we've been doing on the enrollment management side for a long time, right? The schools that are really doing it well, doing the enrollment management piece well, have identified who they are. They've identified their differentiation. They've identified ways in order to build pipeline over time. They speak to the audience that they know they can serve well, and are okay with the audiences that they can't serve well, finding other options. Does that make sense to you? Because it really, like, I just see these incredible parallels.
100%. I think the same core strategic thinking applies in both, and it could go even further, right? Because you could make the hiring or recruitment to admissions parallel very obviously, but then the people practices to enrollment management parallel is also there. So just like smart enrollment people know that our job is not done once we have admitted a student,
Right.
we need to think about how we onboard that student and their family. We need to think about how we're cultivating the relationship with them over time. We should have early warnings about which families have a problem and are therefore at risk of potentially leaving. We should try to talk to them and do something about that before they've left. Similarly throughout people practices.
And the enrollment management director, more often than not now, has a seat at the leadership table. You know, they may often liaise with a board subcommittee, right? So like they've elevated their role. Imagine, like, why would it then feel like awkward to have a chief people officer? Like, it just feels like it's a natural fit and progression of the work that we've been doing on the student side of the house for a long time.
Exactly. And as a school, your most valuable resource are your people, right? Yeah, you can have the best curriculum, you can have the best buildings, all of that. But if you don't have the right teachers and administrators in place, it's all for naught.
And you can model their value too, right? Like, you can begin to understand, like, what is the replacement cost if a teacher leaves, and you begin to start I mean, this is me just thinking out loud. Like, you obviously have this dialed in, but I imagine you could do projections that says, hey, if you have this model in place, it's going to save you X per year on, recruitment costs or whatever the case may be. Like, am I thinking about it the right way?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, we all know that, the cost of a bad hire is exponentially higher. And so I think it's definitely possible to model out, like, what happens if we're able to increase retention by 5%. What does that actually do to our overall cost? Now, of course, retention of the people we want to retain, right? So to be clear about what you value in terms of performance, but absolutely.
Yeah. So I want to dig a little bit deeper on the culture piece, right? Like, I mean, the work that you did at Avenues, how did you approach improving culture so that at the end of the day, you just had a happier work environment?
It's interesting because I think when you talk about culture with many people, there's this perception that it's like this intangible thing, right? It's slippery, it's amorphous. Like, can you measure culture? Can you quantify it? How do you know if you've got it? So I think in my mind, it all starts with just getting really clear about what is the culture that you want? What does it look like? What would it feel like on a day-to-day basis? What would a strong culture look like in a positive sense? And then, just as importantly, can you define what it doesn't look like? So that you're giving people some really clear examples of the culture in action, and when it's actually not present. And that work is, I think, incredibly important, but also difficult, because not everyone might agree about what that culture should be. But putting that stake in the ground, I think, is the foundational element to doing things like we were just talking about on recruitment. How will you be able to compellingly describe to a prospective hire what working at your school is like, and how that might look different than working at another school, unless you've done that work of getting really concrete about what that actually looks like. I think that's step number one.
How does it work? So, I like to point externally to, for when helping folks kind of visualize how it might work, because I don't know, I mean, it doesn't feel like a chief people officer is a prevalent role yet in independent schools. I mean, maybe I'm wrong. I don't hear the title a lot. I guess that's for my first question is, like, where does the chief people officer role kind of sit in terms of, adoption around independent schools? So.
It's definitely very unusual so far. Now, just referring back for a moment, and I'll come back to this, to Min's opening comments when she talked about the baseline of good HR and mentioned hiring well, onboarding really well, taking care of compensation in a thoughtful way. I think that unfortunately the reality is that 90% of independent schools aren't getting that. They're getting HR that is handling their compliance and managing benefits, but is not adding meaningful value across those areas, much less now the higher level sort of alignment with strategy and making organizational culture cohere that Min's been talking about. So I would say that the HR within independent schools is at a very incipient, very basic level as a general rule. I know of a small number of other independent schools that have added senior level, whether it's called a chief human resources officer or a CPO, have added that position to the executive leadership team as a peer with division heads and the CFO and a report to the head of school. But it's pretty small. Most schools are operating with a much more junior and kind of HR with a constricted view of what is possible to ask or hope for from their HR function.
Yeah. I want to come back to thinking about like what does a CPO look like outside of independent schools. But before we do that, do you mind if I do like a kind of a sidebar tangent question?
Great.
For sure. So I know you're really involved with like helping schools understand compensation and developing strategy around that. The question I have around that, and this is something I just haven't been able to unpack, it makes a lot of sense to have a very strategic approach to compensation. Totally get it. What I hear pretty often is, teachers are asking for additional pay for lots of valid reasons. They're being asked to do more, they're putting more hours in on certain things, like all the things, right? But the pressure that administrations face is we're still dealing with the same pot of cash that we've always had. So what I've been trying to get my head around at a very high level, and I apologize, I know this isn't necessarily like where we were starting, but I do want to kind of sneak it in here. Like how might that work? Like if you have limited resources to draw from cash-wise, like what are some of the basic things people should be thinking about around compensation strategy?
I can start, and Diego, please add. So, it's interesting. Compensation is often the tail that wags the dog, right? So it's a thing that people are it's very visible. People are vocal about it. They can compare. But when you dig into it, it is, of course, everyone needs to be fairly compensated for the work that they do. That is something that all employees should be able to expect. But more often than not, it's packaged with a lack of understanding about, well, where do I go? Where does my career go? And if I'm not sure where my career is going, then the only thing that's left for me to focus on is my compensation. And I'm going to compare myself with my peers in other schools. And I'm most likely going to find some people who are being paid more than I am. And I'm just going to feel happy about that and be satisfied and not engage. So I think, when you look at the data across all sectors, compensation is never in the top 5 reasons why people leave their jobs.
Interesting.
It is an important factor. It's not number 100, but it's not the top 5. So I think what that tells us is what people really need to know is, how am I developing as a professional? Are my efforts being acknowledged? And I feel like I'm being fairly rewarded for the work that I'm doing? But so I think part of the work that we're doing with other schools is helping them see that compensation is just one little component of the whole employee experience that needs to be there. Diego, what would you add?
hence the chief people officer.
Indeed.
Yeah. So I wasn't that far off. That's good.
And the only other thing I would add is that, and again, another rationale for the chief people officer, we found at Avenues, we have seen this at other schools as well, that leaders can be very loath to make distinctions about the contributions that different people are making. But we all know that people are making different contributions in the school, different teachers. And so part of the answer when every school has the situation that there is a certain amount of revenue and that revenue has to be paid out in salaries, if you force yourself to give everyone the same and treat everyone the same, regardless of the contributions they are making, you are going to be you are going to be then limiting how you can reward people who are making exceptional contributions to your school. So part of the answer may need to be overcoming that inhibition and starting to articulate for yourself, how will I actually reward in some differentiated ways?
Yeah. So if I'm hearing it correctly, I think this is what you were saying, Min, like lean into the pathway. Like how can you kind of earn that extra compensation, whether it's, I guess it could be money, it could be time away, it could be any number of factors, but you really show like how exceptional work is rewarded. When has been the hesitancy to that? I'm curious.
We could spend the entire podcast on this question. We love thinking about this. I think there is certainly there's something deeply baked in the teaching profession around this, right? Step and lane systems it kind of enforce like you can only measure totally objective criteria of years of experience and education, even though years of experience isn't actually all that objective as a sidebar. There are, I think there's a sense of solidarity among teachers. I think there's, there's the kind of historical unionized relationship, the teaching force to administration, that even if you're not in a union environment, there's still this two groups, two sides issue. So there's no question that if you try to change some of these things, you need to have a lot of trust and a lot of capital built between leaders and teachers. I think leaders are afraid of some of the criticism that they will get. They're afraid of having that person in their office saying, "Hey, I know that she got 5% and I only got 2%," and having to say, "Yeah, and here's why." What else, man?
I think that's exactly right. These are potentially fraught conversations. And unless the leader in that conversation is rock solid about the rationale, right? Like, this is what we value, this is what excellent contribution looks like, and this is where you are meeting, exceeding, or maybe falling short of that. And then having the skills to be able to have that difficult conversation with multiple people. That's a skill that many people just haven't really developed. And it's hard to overcome that sort of culture of nice, right? It's just easier to be non-specific and avoid ruffling feathers or maybe some, tough emotional conversations.
Yeah. I've got a lot of thoughts, but I know we're short on time. We've got a couple more things we want to get through. Just briefly, like what have other sectors in terms of adopting a CPO? What can we learn from that?
Yeah, so I think over the past 15 years or so, you're starting to see literature around sort of the rise of the chief people officer. And as Diego said, sometimes they're called chief human resources officer, sometimes they're called VP of human resources. But there is a sense of across multiple sectors, sort of organizations coming to the realization that having a senior leader who is sort of eagle-eye focused on the people aspects and the culture aspects of an organization actually is valuable. I think some of the lessons learned or examples where that works well are where the CPO and the CEO relationship is, that means that is such a crucial element in the success of the CPO role, right? So if you think of the CEO as providing clear direction to an organization, fostering an environment of open communication and driving engagement and retention, the CPO is aligning all those human capital strategies with those business objectives. And one thing that the CPO and the CEO have sort of a unique ability to do is to unite and align teams across the organization, because those are two roles that are by definition sort of cross-functional, right? People cut across every department in organization. So having that partnership between the CEO and the CPO being, based on a foundation of real trust and mutual understanding is sort of a key component of success. I think two other factors is, I think the people role and the CPO role is becoming more and more data-driven. So how can you really understand the data that you have on your people, hiring, retention, engagement, et cetera, and actually use that data to develop strategies? And then the third component of that's, I think, changed over time from a traditional HR role is this idea that the CPO role is also becoming increasingly sort of a forward-thinking technologist. So how do you actually leverage technology to create efficiencies, to create, to improve the employee experience and engagement? So those are sort of three aspects that maybe are different than what the traditional HR function has been.
Hey, just a couple more questions. So, a lot of what I'm guessing a chief people officer has to do is, like you said it earlier, Diego, it's like all the standard HR stuff, then strategy on top of that. Like if a school said, hey, we already have a lawyer that's dealing with a lot of the compliance things and all those sorts of items, how is this different? Like, how would you respond?
Yeah, we had great lawyers at Avenues too. You can't run a school with having some good lawyers. And you'll notice we had both. We had a high quality people function and we had good lawyers. And the reason is, if you're holding a hammer, every problem looks like a nail. And lawyers hold a specific hammer, right? They are going to hold a risk mitigation hammer, a careful legal compliance hammer. And sometimes that's what you need. But very often we find that schools are overusing their very expensive lawyers because they don't have someone like Min or like me to turn to just talk through the nuances and the complexities of a situation that doesn't need $800 an hour legal expertise. It just needs good people judgment and sound reasoning and a cool head. So I think schools really need to draw on both. And it's your chief people officer who is the one who has the real expertise to know exactly when the lawyer really is needed and when to bring them in and how to use them.
Right. That makes perfect sense to me. But, here's the reality for some schools. Like, they love the concept. They want to have this kind of overarching strategy and they recognize the value. But, there are some schools that just simply can't afford it, right? Like, it's just not within their budget to be able to do make this sort of hire. What are some alternatives? Like, what are some things that they should be thinking about?
I mean, I would say first, look at the team that you have, right? There might actually be the person who is responsible for your HR maybe actually be ready, willing, and able to have the mandate expanded much more significantly. I think a lot of times you deliver what you are expected to deliver. So I think that would be the first step that I look to, think who in our, and it actually may not be someone in HR. My pathway to this role was actually not through traditional HR. I originally was hired at Avenues to lead the strategy team that is thinking about where should we have future Avenues campuses? How do we build a business case for that? As time went on, some of my engagement with people-related activity started to increase, and then when the opportunity came, I think our CEO at that time really valued having someone who understood the strategy and what Avenues was about, more so than tactical understanding of traditional HR function. So that would be the second thing I would look at. It's like, look broadly at your leadership team, and it actually may not be someone who has been traditionally HR.
And because of the issues we talked about in HR and independent schools, it's very likely not to be. If you can find it, if you have someone who's ready to develop from HR, great, but you're more likely to find it elsewhere. And the place to look is who is standing out as a people leader and people manager on your senior leadership team. It might be your head of technology. We had 2 or 3 tech directors at Avenues who very plausibly could have become heads of people. It might be a division head. Who's the person who's consistently hiring great people, has a happy and engaged team that good people don't want to leave? There you might have the makings of a chief people officer.
Yeah, that's great advice.
The other answer we can give is look at fractional chief people officers. So, folks like Min, like myself, like our friends at Carey and Company, there are now services that are beginning to offer this in independent schools. So you as a medium-sized or smaller school, you can't afford this full role, but you could certainly afford 20 or 30% of one.
It's a great entry point.
And if you pair that with Carey, for example, offers outsourced HR services. So you could probably handle your benefits and compliance and those basics better than you're doing now at equal or lower cost, but you can also get some of this strategic people thinking and people advice embedded into your leadership team. And while that 20% can't take on all the projects that a full-time person can, they can give you almost 100% of that strategic thinking value in a lot less time at a cost you can afford.
Yeah, this is great. Hey, just one last question. So imagine a school called you today, and it sounds like schools are calling you, but imagine they called you today and said they're interested in hiring a CPO. What advice would you offer them?
I guess the first thing I would say is why? Why now? What is it that you are expecting this role to do differently than what you currently have? So I guess, in other words, be really clear about the purpose and the rationale and what your expectations are for that role.
Yeah, the why. Always explore the why. Yeah. This is terrific. Well, so Min Kim, Diego Merino, if folks want to follow up with you, how can they get in touch with you?
Let's see. I am on Twitter at Diego Merino NYC. I can be reached on LinkedIn. That's probably the best place at Diego Merino, diego.merino@gmail.com.
I am also on LinkedIn. That's also probably the easiest way to find me. And also via email, kim.min@gmail.com.
Well, thank you both. I appreciate this. Such an interesting topic. It's one that I'm fascinated by, and I really do appreciate you sharing your expertise. So thank you both.
Great. Thank you.
It's been a pleasure. Thanks for having us.
Hi there, my friend. I want to thank RG175 for sponsoring this episode of the Independent School Moonshot podcast. Great schools thrive under great leadership. At RG175, we understand that finding the right match between a school and its next leader is a defining moment for both heads and trustees. With extensive experience in independent school leadership and a highly personalized approach, we guide boards through thoughtful search processes and support school leaders through key career transitions. Whether you're looking for your next leadership opportunity or seeking the ideal fit for your school, RG175 is here to help. Visit rg175.com. Again, that's rg175.com to learn more, because behind every successful school is a great leader.